Hello, and welcome to the TechHub.training Python Functional Taxation Challenge solution video. In this video, I'll go over the code that I made for my solution. In this challenge, we've been asked to create a federal income tax calculator in Python. From the challenge, you would have received the starting code found here, and our job is to create this last bit of code just to finish off the calculation. Before I go over the remaining code, I wanted to first go over the flowchart so that those who aren't as familiar with the challenge or with what we're exactly coding can understand the exact process that we're trying to build. If you have already read over the flowchart, feel free to skip ahead in the video to where I start talking about the code. The process begins by calling the function. We then input our filing status, and the filing status is checked. If, for example, our filing status is single, then the standard deduction value and the tax bracket for a single person is then selected. If we are filing our taxes as a married person, we're then asked if we are filing jointly or if we are filing separately. If we're filing jointly or separately, then the associated standard deduction value and tax bracket for that specific filing type is then chosen. For any errors in either of the statements, the process then returns back to the input field where we can then start again. All of the starting code covers the area that is blue, so ideally you shouldn't be coding any of this area. Moving on with the rest of the process, we then input our income for this tax year. We then selected whether we want to do an itemized deduction or a standard deduction. It's assumed that if you choose itemized, then you already know the value of your itemized deduction, but if not, then the standard deduction, which was pulled earlier above, is automatically assigned to the deduction variable. Whichever deduction type you choose is then put into this calculation, where taxable income is equal to the income minus the deduction value, the deduction being either the standard or the itemized. Moving on in the process, it then enters a for loop. This for loop will then loop continually until the taxable bracket is outside of the range of the taxable income. So the first decision is whether the taxable income is less than or equal to the tax bracket. If yes, then the tax owed for that bracket is then added, and then the for loop exits, outputting the result. If no, then it adds the tax owed for that tax bracket, and then the next higher bracket is then chosen. The process then repeats itself until the taxable income is less than or equal to the tax bracket. Now moving on through the code. I'll begin by working through the starting code, but if you already understand it, then feel free to skip ahead again to where I actually talk about the solution portion. I start the code by defining the function. This Fed income tax calculation is known as a function, which can then be later called as you see in the last line of the code. The first step is to determine the appropriate standard deduction and income tax bracket based on the filing status. To do this, we use an input function to ask what is your tax filing status, and then we give a few options here so that the user can know roughly what to type. We use a .lower method to turn any results that a person types into the lowercase version of that particular word. This helps us to avoid any capitalization or any sort of weird formatting that the user might input when inputting their filing status. From there, we enter a conditional if statement, which checks whether the filing status is single, head of household, or married. If the person is married, there is another input statement which then asks them to specify whether they're filing separately or jointly. For each respective filing status, the code gives you the respective standard deduction and the tax bracket for the particular filing status. Note that the tax brackets are a list of tuples, where the first value in each tuple is the minimum value of the tax bracket, and the second value is the particular tax rate for that specific bracket. If for any reason the user does not enter one of the filing status values, then the else clause will call the original function again to then restart the process. Now we can move on to the solution portion. Consistent with the flowchart, I begin by asking what their income is for the tax year, as we can see here. We then know that the next step we want to go through is figuring out what their type of deduction is. So here we determine the deduction type and calculate the taxable income by subtracting the deduction. Here we have the deduction is equal to that input function again. where we ask, would you like to itemize or take the standard deduction of that standard deduction type being the variable above? And then we have two options, itemize or standard. If the deduction is equal to itemized, then we ask again using an input function for how much they want the itemized value to be. We then convert that to a float because we know that it's going to be a currency value. If they chose standard, then we just continue on with the standard deduction that was pulled earlier. I also included another error statement to restart the program again, just in case they mistype something. Now in the challenge it states that the taxable income and the tax owed should not be negative. And some ways that people may do this is by using a if statement or other conditional sort of statement to check whether the actual value of the taxable income is negative number. But we can use the max function here to increase efficiency and instead put the value as either the income minus the deduction or just have it as 0 because we know that 0 is greater than a negative number, and so the value will always either be a positive number or 0. Moving on, we now are entering that for loop portion of the flowchart, and this is probably the most difficult portion of the code. I'm excited to see the different ways that people handled this portion of the code. So feel free to add your code to the challenge comments on TechHub.training. I'm interested to see how you tackled this portion of the challenge. To help me go through this for loop portion, I've put in this tax bracket here for 2022 for a single filer, just to help me give you more of a visual representation of the tax bracket and what the code is doing, so I don't have to keep going back to this list of tuples that might be a little confusing. I begin by having the tax owed is equal to 0. This is just so that as we continue to sum onto this variable that it has a starting value of 0 already. So the for loop begins by iterating through every single tuple within that tax brackets list that we've created earlier. You'll see that I've added a couple of print statements here. This is just to help you see as I actually run the formula just what exactly is going on. So I'm going to run the code. So here you'll see that I've called the function here, and when I click run, it's going to run that code. It's going to ask me what is my tax filing status. I'm going to type single, and then for my income, I'm going to go with what is in the challenge as a check figure of 75,000, and I'm going to take that standard deduction. And so you'll see that because I have these print statements in here, it's printed out a couple of numbers as I've iterated through. And so I'll go through and show you what exactly is going on. So it begins, it says, is the taxable income of 75,000 less than or equal to 0? It is not, so it goes to the next one. The next stage, it then asks, okay, well, have we iterated through the entire list yet? The list being equal to the length of the tax brackets -1 because Python is 0 indexed, but the len function is not 0 indexed. And so the reason we have this is because in the following if statements, we have an I plus 1. And so if we're already in the last tuple of the list, there is no such thing as +1. And so that's going to cause an error. So we want to catch that error before it can occur. And so this is not relevant because at this point we know that 75,000 is going to be less than 500k. So we're never going to get to this last bracket. So this portion of the if statement is never going to trigger for us. But continuing down, we then ask, okay, is the taxable income less than or equal to the tax bracket, the next highest tax bracket minimum value, which is going to be 10,000. So it is not less than that value. And so it goes to the else statement. And the else statement is saying the taxes owed is going to be equal to 0 or whatever is currently in taxes owed, plus the maximum tax that we'll pay in this bracket, being the difference between the next bracket and this bracket, or 10,275 times 10%, which is going to equal this $1,027.5. Next, it's going to iterate. So this I is then going to increment by 1, and it's going to check the next bracket. So now we're in this 12% bracket, or as you can see here, we're in this tuple here. And again, it's going to ask, is the taxable income of $75,000, is it lower than this number here? Is it lower than this number here? It's not. So is it the last tuple in the list? It's not. And so it's going to ask again, okay, the next one up, 41,000, is the taxable income lower than this? It's not. So then it goes to the else statement again, and it goes through that same equation. However, this time it's going to add the maximum taxes owed in this tax bracket, being the 41,000 minus the 10,000 times the 12%, and then it's going to add that to the taxes from the previous equation. And that's going to equal $4,807.50, and then it's going to repeat. Now it gets to the next iteration. It's going to say, okay, is the taxable income less than 41,000? It's not. Is it the last one? Is it the last one? No, it's not. Okay, is 75,000 less than the next higher bracket, which is 89,000? It is. This elif statement here knows that you're not going to go to the next higher bracket, so you can't take the maximum amount of tax within this tax bracket. So instead, it's replacing this 89,000 with the taxable income of 75,000, and then taking whatever value that is, and then adding it to whatever taxes we've already accumulated in the previous section of 4,800, and that's going to equal $9,268. Now the reason this prints out again is because I have this print statement here, because after this elif statement, it's going to then go through one more time and check, is the taxable income of 75,000 less than that next bracket, which is equal to this 24% tax rate bracket, and it is less than, so it's going to break, and then it's going to print out the final taxes owed. But hopefully that you can understand my thought process with going through this more efficient way of calculating the tax brackets. I expect that there will be a lot of people who will just go through a lot of if-else statements, just using the brackets in a different way. Like I mentioned before, I'm interested to see the various ways of how people manage to calculate it. But let me know in the comments on TechHub.training, and thank you for watching.